The meeting began without lights and without ceremony. At 2:13 a.m. UTC, an encrypted alert bloomed across command channels and pulled half a dozen people out of bed. No briefing packet, no slides, only a single blunt message: immediate tracking anomaly. By the time the operations team assembled in the dimmed control room, analysts were already projecting new data onto the central screen. What unfolded in the next 4 hours forced every space agency and defense command to reimagine the problem they had been pretending was contained to a single object named 3IATLAS. At first, the data looked like noise, tiny point sources in the raw exposure from an observatory perched high in the Atacama. Fluctuations that could be blamed on cosmic rays, instrument error, or processing artifacts. But when an imaging specialist ran the frames through a different set of filters designed to pierce electromagnetic interference, the pattern remained. The specks resolved into shapes, not random, not natural, geometric and precise, repeating across multiple independent exposures taken by telescopes on different continents. Within 90 minutes, the emergency room had a new hypothesis, and enough corroborating evidence to stop calling it a hypothesis. What the world thought was a single alien object was a central pillar in a much larger structure. Hidden in the wake of 3IATLAS, cloaked by active interference and subtle gravitational lensing, were additional bodies. Not four incidental shadows, but a constellation organized with purpose. Follow-up scans from radio arrays, millimeter observatories, and optical telescopes all reported the same count: 7 primary elements in formation, with dozens more faint contacts resolving when instruments were pushed beyond normal operating modes. Each detection reinforced the same conclusion. Whatever had engineered the flagship had fabricated companions to move with it and around it as an integrated system. Spectral fingerprints told the same story. The material signatures of the escorts matched the flagship in unusual ways. Isotopic ratios inconsistent with stellar or planetary formation. Electromagnetic emission profiles that made human alloys look like primitive mixtures. The objects shared identical interference footprints and responded to gravitational perturbations in manners that implied a shared control regime. It was impossible to treat them as isolated craft. They behaved like modules of a single distributed machine. Tactical analysts in the room rubbed their eyes and fed positional data into orbital mechanics models. The geometry of the formation was not merely incidental. It followed a set of spatial relations that matched ancient human doctrines of protection and projection. The smaller elements flanked the central mass in layered shells that maximized coverage across incoming vectors, while preserving the flagship a central locus. Distances between elements were not approximate. They reflected precise ratios, repeated across radial tiers, as if an unseen hand had solved a design problem and then copied the solution across scale. When the models simulated response options, the results were terrifyingly consistent. The fleet could reconfigure into compact assault clusters, fan out into interdiction swarms, or separate into decentralized nodes capable of striking disparate coordinates simultaneously. From a defensive perspective, the formation permitted redundancy and concentrated force at will. From an offensive perspective, the arrangement provided options humans had never had to plan against. Engineers compared the response latencies across the fleet and concluded that whatever linked the craft allowed synchronization at intervals shorter than light travel between them. Communications were either exploiting physics humans did not yet understand, or they were not communications in any human sense. Energy assessments only deepened the crisis mood. Each major element emitted basal power levels that dwarfed terrestrial infrastructure. The flagship and its companions produced continuous fluxes of energy incompatible with known reactors and inconsistent with any chemical or nuclear baseline. Some instruments recorded anomalies in local spacetime metrics near the vessels. Gravitational wave detectors observed modulations that hinted at controlled curvature at scales small enough to manipulate trajectories without expelling discernible mass or exhaust. Thrust, if it existed in our terms, came without signatures we could track. Mobility looked more like the reconfiguration of geometry than the application of force. Defense planners stopped using the word invasion and began using the word occupation when presenting scenarios. The fleet was not passing through. It had staged itself in a way that could establish long-term presence if it chose to do so. Sensor sweeps revealed specialized hull morphologies. Some escorts resembled industrial platforms scaled to planetary levels. Others suggested habitation volumes larger than many cities. A subset bore shapes and emission patterns consistent with systems optimized for directed energy projection and matter manipulation. There was, in short, a logistics capability, a strike capability, and an environmental engineering capability embedded in the group. Worse still, the detections increased. New objects bled out from the flagship like blossom petals unfolding. Each day, more contacts appeared as processing thresholds were tuned and as smaller craft shifted into detection windows. Conservative analysts estimated final numbers in the low hundreds. More pessimistic teams tabulated scenarios where thousands of subunits could be present when counting resumed at deeper sensitivity. The math changed from tracking discrete assets to anticipating the emergent behavior of an engineered system that replicated and scaled. Governments reacted with a blend of protocol activation and stunned silence. Secure meetings convened among nuclear states. International institutions that had been dormant for existential contingencies were suddenly revived and repurposed for an event that did not fit old templates. National defense architectures were rethought in hours. Supply nodes and information systems were hardened while public communications were tightly managed to avoid societal collapse. The order of operations favored preservation because confrontation felt increasingly nonsensical. Scientists and theologians, economists and cultural historians found themselves recalibrating their questions. The fleet's measured approach suggested intent. It also suggested control over the pace of revelation. If the craft could close in hours, why were they not closing in hours? The delay indicated choice. That exposed a chilling possibility. The observers among humanity might be part of a staged contact sequence designed either to coerce or to condition. Displaying capability while withholding immediate action could be an instrument of influence rather than a sign of mercy. Analysis of formation geometry revealed a calculated understanding of human observation capabilities. The fleet hid within interference, but not completely. It revealed itself only when someone looked closely enough and adjusted their instruments. The resulting psychological effect was maximal. Alarm coupled with cognitive overwhelm. Humans were given a view of the enemy that made resistance feel futile in some models and reasoned negotiation impossible in others. The technical implications were staggering. Hull materials bore isotopes that implied transmutation and fabrication processes at scales approaching stellar engineering. Power signatures required energy densities that suggested harnessing or redirecting fundamental properties of vacuum or spacetime. The fleet did not simply outmatch human systems. It rendered many human assumptions about cause and effect unreliable. Weapons predicated on mass, momentum, or chemical reaction were now conceptual toys. Policy teams began to ask questions no emergency playbook had anticipated. How do you negotiate when the other side can alter the constants that underlie your bargaining chips? Can you credibly threaten a force capable of erasing mass itself? Do you attempt to communicate, to submit, or to hide? Succession and continuity plans shifted from national narratives to species survival strategies. Archives of human knowledge were consolidated, seed vaults were widened, and multilingual cultural repositories were prepared for subterranean storage. The conversation moved from how to win to how to preserve memory, should defeat be unavoidable. Yet the fleet waited. Its trajectory brought it inexorably inward, but at a tempo that allowed, superficially, for observation, and perhaps for certain human choices. Some analysts argued this was strategic benevolence. Others saw psychological manipulation intended to fracture alliances and provoke surrender without combat. Military planners could not find a scenario where conventional arms presented a path to victory. Deterrence modeling crumbled under the new parameters. Instead, contingency planners embraced resilience as the metric that must be optimized. A human question remained central and unresolved. What did the fleet intend to achieve when it reached proximity? Extraction and settlement, resource reconfiguration, cultural assimilation, total annihilation. Each possibility carried unique operational signatures and unique time horizons. The sheer scale of the fleet's capabilities made any single answer provisional. The more sophisticated analyses treated the event as a long game. If the fleet could engineer gravitational fields and manipulate material constants, they could manufacture environments, reconfigure planetary surfaces, and reassign ecological functions at scale. That suggested objectives beyond mere conquest into the realm of planetary remodeling. Back channels and clandestine dialogues multiplied. Some leaders proposed offering up zones of unpopulated land as bargaining chips. Others counseled silence and concealment. Scientists attempted contact experiments designed to speak in math and in physics, hoping to appeal to engineers who might find parity in logic. Communication attempts produced bursts of constrained feedback that were indecipherable. There was no graceful handshake. There was data, and then more data, and no human codebook capable of translating the signal into intent. The countdown to a pivotal date became the axis of public imagination. Calendars were marked. Rituals that once belonged to festivals became measures of dread. The fleet's arrival into a range capable of direct influence was predicted in precise terms by orbital models. That precision allowed for planning, if not for optimism. The timeline was no longer about days and weeks, but about choices. Every prepared action, every secured archive, every patched network, and stocked facility represented a human attempt to carve possibility out of inevitability. As the objects moved closer, observatories reported an increase in low-frequency emissions consistent with the modulation of background fields. Machines calibrated to measure entropy flux, registered gradients inconsistent with thermodynamic equilibria, expected at that scale. The fleet was doing something to the canvas of physics in its local neighborhood. How deep that alteration extended remained uncertain. Some researchers argued it was local and limited. Others warned that the instruments were merely the first to notice alterations that could cascade. Leaders stopped reassuring and began planning. Plans were no longer about defense in a classical sense, but about continuity in the broadest terms. Preservation of species knowledge, genetic resources, and cultural artifacts replaced talk of victory. The calculus was brutal and pragmatic. If survival meant hiding some fraction of humanity until conditions changed, then that plan had to be executable. If survival meant bargaining for Earth's future status within a larger interstellar economy, then negotiators would need language and leverage no advisor, yet knew how to produce. Across the planet, ordinary life folded into tension. Markets tightened, borders adapted, and rituals once taken for granted were observed with a new gravity. Religious institutions convened. Scientists published open letters. Civic leaders urged calm and ordered preparedness. The awareness that we were watching a force capable of rewriting the rules of existence left communities oscillating between awe and terror. The fleet kept its pace and its posture. It had the ability to end the experiment whenever it wished. It also had the ability to let it play out. That ambiguous restraint became a variable humans could not ignore. In the quiet between alerts, analysts returned to mathematics, trying to find a flaw in the adversary's symmetry. Philosophers asked whether the measure of a civilization was military might or the capacity to surprise and to spare. In the weeks that followed, humanity did not unify into a single voice, yet neither did it fracture irreparably. Protocols held in many places. Secrets multiplied in others. The practical work of preparing for multiple futures continued even as the question of intent remained unanswered. The fleet hovered between demonstration and decision, and the human response was a patchwork of ingenuity and fear. When the date on the calendar finally arrived, the world watched as one. Whether that day marked the opening of a new chapter for life on Earth, or the conclusion of an era only time and events would decide. For now, the record is simple and blunt. We saw something arrive that challenged the meaning of force and intelligence. We discovered that we were small in ways we had not previously understood, and we were left to read the signals the fleet provided while trying, with all the tools we possess, to shape a future from the options still available to us.